Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie Lake, and today we are focusing on the defense sector with Ian Weiner, founder and CEO of Center15 Capital. Hi, Ian. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Maggie. I appreciate it.
And congrats on the fund, which just recently launched, if I'm not mistaken. So let's start there. Fill us in. What's Center15 Capital all about?
Center15 Capital is about investing in private companies that are in their growth stage, that are focused on critical tech that's being built for national security. And so companies that range anywhere from sort of what people think of as traditional defense technologies to semiconductors and any other companies that make product that fits into sort of what we need to defend the country.
So, which is, I can't think of a more critical sector right now because of everything that's going on in the world, which we'll talk about. But your background is rooted in the military, but you spent most of your career on Wall Street, I think, right? Give us a brief backgrounder of how you ended up sort of focusing on this sector.
Yeah, so I went to West Point a very long time ago. Eventually got down to Wall Street and worked at various roles, mostly in equity trading. Everything from working on the sell side at various firms to working at a couple of large hedge funds. Sat next to Steve Cohen for 3 years and managed his technology portfolio. And then wound up leaving the public markets in 2018 and wound up working at another firm at the time that was focused on investing in late stage growth companies in the private markets, sector agnostic. But as it happened, coincidentally, the first big position that they were building, and then we continued to build once I got to the firm, was in Palantir. And so when Palantir went public, Disruptive, the firm I was at the time, was seen as their largest shareholder in their paperwork. And so while defense was not necessarily the focus of the firm, it quickly became a focus just given our experience with Palantir. At that point, I got to know the two brothers who co-founded Shield AI, and was instrumental in our firm leading their Series D. And then Ukraine got invaded and defense technology became this big investing theme, and it hadn't been that way for my entire life, really. And I happened to be the one person at the firm that had some defense background, and so found my way back into this world and began essentially running the defense tech investing arm of my firm with a focus on sourcing and diligencing the companies as part of what we did.
It's kind of wild, that full circle, right? I mean, you start out going to West Point and then kind of probably thought you're on a different path, and then here you are back in defense.
Yes, life has a funny way of doing that. But yeah, I found my way back into this world, and then just the events and the macro situation sort of made it something that I dug in and been very focused on, and continue to view it as a critical mission. Investing clearly, but also there's some reasons for freedom overall to continue to be a part of it.
Yeah. So, you mentioned that it was the first time in your lifetime, and I just want to pick up on that because I mean, when you think about the defense sector, I think most people think kind of stodgy, slow moving, kind of really the kind of big warship type thing, like moving that, not too much happens. It's pretty, it's defensive itself, in people's portfolios. But is that changing? What can you tell us about what you're seeing from this being an investment theme? Does it seem like it's here to stay? Is it sort of just moving with the headlines based on Ukraine? How would you quantify or qualify this investment theme?
So what I'd say is that there is a change happening that has not happened in really since certainly the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, and maybe since Vietnam. And what's happened is we are seeing a new era of warfare and a new era of competition that we have not seen. So what I think has happened, and I say that it hasn't been that way for a lifetime, is really two reasons. One, we've been far and away the superior military and have been able to operate at will basically around the globe. Nobody could match our air power, our Navy, our Army. And so we sort of did what we wanted without threat. The second thing is because of that, historically, the way that the venture community worked in defense technology for companies that aren't the big primes like you talked about, like Lockheed and Northrop, is they would create a product. It might be a great product for the military for a variety of reasons. They might get some grant money, they might get some government funding, and they might get a little investor money from different areas. But then the problem was, in order for that company to really be successful, they had to get what is known as a program of record, which essentially is an actual line item in the budget, which says you are going to be paid this money pretty much no matter what. And that's where the hundreds of millions of dollars came. And the time between those two events would take a decade. And it was literally called, and still is, the Valley of Death, because it took that long. And so most venture funds were not willing to fund companies for a decade before they got any real revenue from the government. And the reason it was that long was because the government didn't need to move quickly because there were no threats that forced us to move quickly. And so what's changed is, kind of twofold. One, you now have real threats, China being the biggest. But certainly we've seen in the Middle East, we've seen in Russia, that these are, the capable militaries that pose a real threat. The bigger issue is what we've seen in Ukraine. And what we've seen there is the ability of small, attributable, cheap devices like drones take out large, expensive platforms like tanks and planes and personnel carriers. And the Houthis have been able to essentially stop shipping using drones that sometimes cost thousands of dollars. And our solution to that has been to fire missiles at those drones that cost millions of dollars. So unsustainable. So what that's forced is the Department of Defense, Congress, pretty much everybody in a bipartisan fashion to realize, wait a second. We've been sort of, funding the defense companies in a way that's essentially like a cost plus model, which does not incentivize speed, does not incentivize innovation. And as a result, we've now found ourselves sort of on our back feet a little bit. And so what the government has decided that, wait a second, we need to start, shrinking that valley of death. We need to get these companies that actually have the most advanced technology money quicker. And so because of that change, the venture community has now got a much bigger appetite for these companies because they realize wait a second, we're not going to have to wait 10 years before we see any real revenue. It might happen in 18 months. And so that is what I think are the main catalysts for why this sector is becoming a lot more interesting, and why I think we're in the first inning of really what's about to take place, really over the next generation as far as the way we think about defense. You have new domains like space, you have new technologies like autonomy and artificial intelligence, and so how do we change the way that we conduct this is a dilemma, but it's one that we realize we need to do. And we don't necessarily have a distinct advantage like we used to. Right,
which is a massive change and a point of sort of great concern, I know, for people who watch this space. It introduces all sorts of uncertainties. So VCs were not the sort of valley of death stifled innovation. So now it sounds like from what you're saying, the private equity VC community is interested again. Is there the innovative intellectual capital or talent there ready to sort of found those companies? Because let's face it, if you had those skills, you were also not looking to go into defense for all the reasons that you just eloquently stated. So do we have that? I mean, I visited, if you go to Carnegie Mellon, DARPA's been in there for a long time. And so there are definitely projects. I've seen the robot soldiers up close, and there's some really impressive things going on. But how big is that ecosystem?
So, that's the right question to ask, and it's getting significantly bigger. There's a lot of company formation happening. There's some ideas that are probably never going to work, but there's a lot more to choose from. I think that that's being offset by a significant amount of venture capital, early stage capital that's being allocated to this sector. But there are companies out there to match it. And when I think as a proxy, when I talk to people getting out of the military, some of them, friends of mine, there's a new sort of desire to come up with tech that either they needed as a service member or saw work and want to improve upon. Shield AI is a perfect example. The one co-founder was a Navy SEAL. They lost a lot of soldiers clearing buildings. Their drones did not work well, so they went out and founded a company and created a drone that could fly into buildings on its own and do its own thing without GPS or RF signals. And that was drawn from experience. And we're seeing that across the board. And people, I think, are looking at this now. And I wouldn't underestimate the change in psychology of the American people in general, which is, it wasn't too long ago that, Google refused to do business with the U.S. government, that employees were protesting all the time about companies doing business with the United States Department of Defense, which, ironically, they were happy to do business in China, but they would not. That has changed. And Ukraine was a large catalyst for that because people suddenly realized, like, wow, freedom matters. And companies like Palantir led the charge on that and continue to lead the charge on that change in mentality. And so, we're seeing more and more people, military, non-military, there's more and more engineering talent. You talk about schools like Carnegie Mellon, but, across the board where there's just a different attitude about joining in this effort. And they see that, the companies are hiring. It's an exciting time. There's going to be more IPOs. And so what we're seeing is more and more, both military and non-military, who are much more inclined to start up companies that address, not just the Defense Department, but also commercial applications, but that are much more inclined to do it than they would have been even a few years ago, where it was considered not as acceptable, I should say.
Fascinating and a great observation, I think. So what kind of growth potential are we looking at broadly for the industry?
So I think that there's two ways that I sort of look at it. The first is, you have an overall pie that's expanding dramatically. So, this year you'll have well over probably $2.5 trillion spent globally on defense, which is up, 10% from last year. And that number should continue to grow. So the overall pie will continue to expand. And a lot of that is, yes, the U.S., but really there's a lot of international spend. If you think about, like, the countries around the world saw what happened in Ukraine and still see it and have sort of come to the conclusion that they'd rather have stuff in place now, but not before they get invaded, as a deterrent. And so countries that historically, just look at Germany and Japan, right? These were countries that never spent a lot of money on defense. Japan, nothing. And now there's a massive increase in spend. And that's, Japan sees China, Japan sees North Korea firing missiles and have decided, you know what? It's wonderful that the U.S. has pledged to defend us, but, let's put some stuff in place ourselves. India, third largest defense spender in the world, continues to kind of ramp up spending. So that pie should continue to expand. What I think is even more important is that within that pie, you're seeing a dramatic shift to the new technologies that we touched on earlier. That is where the key bull case is that I see for this sector, for the private growth stage defense tech, national security type companies, which is, we've got to, instead of buying that next gigantic, aircraft carrier, which is still important, but instead of spending, billions upon billions upon billions of dollars on that platform, we should redirect some of that money to the Space Force, to companies doing artificial intelligence, to companies working on cybersecurity, because that's the future of how these things are going to be conducted. So we can either pretend like these big platforms are going to just continue to dominate everything, or we can see what's actually happening in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and say, you know what, maybe we need to shift the way we're spending and how we're spending it. And I think that that's really where the bull case sort of comes alive in growth stage private companies.
Yeah. So do you think that this answers a question that has been on my mind for some time, which is the old adage that, if you have the Navy, you have the power, right? But that seems like it is clearly no longer the case, especially given what you've seen with the Houthis, as you mentioned. Do you think that countries, do you think countries will continue to spend on things like a big naval presence, these very expensive airplanes and copters and that sort of big equipment that costs billions, that especially in some of the prototypes may work or not work right at the end of 10 years. That's when you're finding it out. Do you think they'll keep spending in those areas? And then the second part of that question is, this is a game changer because you don't have to have the expertise to build these giant warships. Now we're talking about a lot of countries potentially getting back into the defense game that we're not able to before, if we're talking about things like technology, right?
Yeah, I mean, so there will always be, a need to have naval superiority. I think what the question is, and the one you're asking is the right one, is what does that mean? And I think what it meant even 5-10 years ago is not what it means today. And the reason is because technology is changing so quickly that, what it means to have naval superiority, used to be, big ship, some fighter jets, project power, and that was enough to deter anybody from doing anything to us. Now, realistically, enemies have hypersonic missiles. They have different things that they don't render those aircraft carriers useless, for sure. But they're a lot more vulnerable. And as a result, we need to figure out what projecting power means. And now, there are multiple programs that the military has decided are the future and are working towards. One of them is called Replicator. And Replicator is basically, how do we put, 1,000 drones up over the South China Sea, working together as a team? And how do we create masses of unmanned vehicles to perform a mission, because one, they save our lives. We're not actually have people involved, other than sort of being in the loop, so to speak. And two, they're cheap. It's one thing to, you fly these big spy planes over the South China Sea, and if you lose one of them, it's $50 million and 12 soldiers or airmen. If instead you put 1,000 drones that cost $1 million a piece over the South China Sea, and they're able to do all the surveillance the same way, and 20% get shot down, it doesn't matter. The other 80% are already working together still on the mission. You haven't lost any people. And what you did lose was a lot cheaper than if you start losing big platforms. So I think what's changed is the way that the Navy is going to project the same kind of power is going to employ different tools than they used to.
As you're describing this, I'm just thinking to myself in the moment that if it is if you're able to conduct war without the loss of human life and quicker and cheaper, what are the deterrents? But that's an entirely ethical conversation that we'll have to have at another time. But you can understand why people get concerned about sort of technology running away. But we're going to keep it on the investment theme for now. So we've been talking about NVIDIA, ad nauseum when we're following markets, right? Is it topped? Is the AI bubble bursting? Is it this chip? Is it Blackwell? I mean, all of that. Is there an AI play in defense?
Oh, 100%. The AI play is, I would think about it from a strategic, so big picture, versus tactical, which is sort of how we actually conduct that strategy. So the first thing is, from a strategic perspective, right? Generals, the president, everybody sort of comes up with what's the strategy if we get into conflict, or what's the strategy to deter, the enemy. And it's possible that, there's no reason why you can't use generative AI models to say to your large language model or whatever derivative there is of it that, hey, here's the battle scenario. Here's my acceptable losses. Here are, the different tools I want to use. Here are all the different, inputs. What's the battle plan? And the battle plan will come out just the same way that other things come out. Now, it doesn't mean that that's going to be the decision, but, there's no reason why that can't be a part of the playbook. And so I think that you will have more and more of that. That is a strategic asset. We have the best AI models in the world. There's no reason not to use them as another tool to say, okay, well, what could be a strategy? On the tactical level, what you're seeing is AI being used to control unmanned systems in a fashion that works in what we call denied environments. So I don't think a lot of people realize that in Ukraine, 95% of the drones that are being used do not reach their target. And the reason they don't reach their target is because the enemy, Russia and Ukraine, when facing each other, have very sophisticated jamming technology. And so if a device uses a radio frequency signal from a user controlling it, or it requires GPS to operate, it's easily taken down by electronic spoofing and jamming. So the challenge is, well, how do you create a drone that can work without GPS, without RF signal? And the only way you can do that is by using artificial intelligence and software that can create autonomy. And so the drone essentially operates on its own. I mean, there's a human that can kill switch, and there's a human that controls some aspects of it, but doesn't have to. And that is where AI comes in. There's another big program that people should be aware of called Collaborative Combat Aircraft, or CCA. This is the future of the Air Force. They're clear about it. And what it is instead of the old days of Top Gun, where you'd have two pilot and a co-pilot and dogfighting with other planes, now it's let's put up one fighter jet with one pilot, and we'll fly 4 to 6 drones on its wings, either in front or behind. And the pilot will control those drones, and send them into different missions based on how dangerous it is. And so how do you do that? It's very, very difficult. The only way you can do it is with artificial intelligence and the fighter jet controlling the other planes using AI. And so those are just a couple of ways that artificial intelligence is going to be used and is being developed right now in order to make us more effective as a fighting force.
So AI is a general at the table and presumably your wingman now.
Yes, certainly, part of that equation for sure.
Wow, it is a brave new world for sure. Is the government a partner in funding this, or are they a client, or both?
Well, they're both. I mean, they're clearly, still funding a lot of this stuff. There's to give you an idea how much things have changed. There's in the Office of Strategic Capital, they have created a program where if you are a venture fund focused on national security, you can theoretically work with the government, and the government will essentially allow you to leverage up their capital as well. So they will match dollars, I think up to as much as $175 million. So if you raise a $100 million fund from your investors, and you can demonstrate to the government that that money is going to go to critical tech for national security, and they evaluate that and conclude that yes, there is a program in place that they will then match you dollar for dollar up to a certain amount. So it enables different funds to be able to match and essentially enhance their position sizing. And it's really the government acting as an investor. And it's just one other sort of element of the bull case where you just have a lot of funds now deciding that like we're gonna help these companies grow and grow quickly because the more capital they have, the less reliant they are on just venture money, the quicker, in theory at least, they can get product into the field.
Yeah, it's that long capital in that space, with the sort of deeper roots and sort of mitigating risk and creating a market. They use that sometimes. The multilaterals use that sometimes when they're developing countries. They come in as the sort of lender with heft in order to sort of facilitate that riskier capital coming in that may have a shorter time horizon. So that's really fascinating. Sounds really fascinating and innovative, and something you wouldn't expect the government to be front of because you would just think of it as so bureaucratic. So it is really interesting. I guess it sort of begs the question: do we feel like the global landscape, geopolitical landscape has changed, the nature of warfare has changed, technology is changing things rapidly? Do you feel like at least the U.S. government, because it sounds like that's the one that you're most closely associated with, but correct me if I'm wrong, or that you have a line of sight on, is the U.S. government keeping pace? Is the Department of Defense keeping pace with these changes? Or are they catching up?
I mean, I think they've gone from sort of getting caught flat-footed to now moving with a sense of urgency. And that's part of the thesis as well, is there has to be a bipartisan sense of urgency and a sense of urgency within the Defense Department to make this happen. And what's changed is people are scared. And so if people are scared, and rightfully so, because the world is clearly becoming more and more dangerous each day, unfortunately, people tend to move quickly. It's kind of like people don't tend to change their lifestyles until they get sick. And so I think, we've seen a lot of the same mentality in the government for many years. And, there's still a lot of work to do. But what I would say is I feel like, we realize that there's an issue. We're doing things to address those issues. These things take time. But it's clear that the message is we are going to be much more open to younger companies making more off-the-shelf type stuff that's more software driven, and that is where a lot of the opportunity is.
Yeah, good point too, from hardware to software. So let's talk about how the legacy private sector is approaching this, because when you talk about defense, as I mentioned at the top, we think of it as sort of stodgy, as the 800-pound gorillas, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman. And when you look at the ETFs, the largest ones, whether it's iShares or Invesco or any of the ones you pull up, those are the companies that are still their top holdings, right? So for the average person, if you're investing in defense, you're investing in those big legacy companies, RTX, which was formerly Raytheon, which people may recognize that name too. Are these large companies, what's their role in this? Are they also making these investments? Are they standing there ready to hoover up these smaller, innovative, nimble players who are now pushing into the technology area? How is that, or are they competition to them? How is that working?
So I think that they've also realized that, they need to move more quickly. I think that there's still an entrenched sort of system in place for those companies to continue to sort of take their time, and they're big organizations that don't move very quickly. They have realized that investing in these companies is very important. In the last couple of years, we've seen many defense primes get into the venture space. So, Lockheed has had and has a venture arm. Booz Allen has a very good venture arm that they started recently. Most of those companies, Raytheon as well, they all now have money that they're investing off their balance sheet into early stage defense and national security companies. And they're not doing it to make money. They're doing it because they see business development opportunities. And so they're accelerating the business of these young companies by helping them navigate what's a very tricky Department of Defense. And so that's one aspect of it. They're changing their philosophies internally. It's harder because they're just sprawling businesses. And yes, they are buying some of these companies. What I would say is that M&A in this sector is not something I see a lot of happening. And the reason is, back in the mid 90s, there was something called the Last Supper where, there at the time were 45, 50 defense companies. And they were told during the Clinton years when there was a big downsizing happening that you guys better either merge or you're going to go out of business because we're not going to be spending like we were. And so now those 40 companies, 50 companies have become 5. And so those 5 companies, most of which you just mentioned, dominate the Defense Department and defense spending. And so, the reason we've had issues is, supply chain. There haven't been many suppliers for various technologies because there's been no competition because there's only been 5 companies. So I think and rightfully so, the FTC and different groups are not going to be very excited about a ton of mergers and acquisitions in the defense sector. Smaller stuff, yes, but in general, I don't see that happening as much.
That's so interesting. For someone like you who's in on the venture side, then you're looking for these companies to IPO and then grow into very big dominant companies, much like Palantir.
Yes.
Very interesting. So what do you look for in a company when they're pitching you? Because when we're talking about technology, you mentioned some of the areas that are probably, growing the fastest and first just based on what we've seen around the world, and that is drones and the use of AI. But what do you look for in a company?
So I look for a company that is typically 3 to 4 years away from going public. So I'm focused on, I don't know if I'd call it late stage, but certainly closer to late stage than early stage. I'm looking for a company that's, has real visibility, either is already through that valley of death on certain programs and their products, or at least has very good visibility into the program of record that we discussed. That is sort of the most important thing for these companies. And if I can find that, and a company that is clearly demonstrating that software is going to be a very important part of their business. And, because in order to get a good exit, a company has to be able to tell the story and demonstrate that this is a software company with some hardware, as opposed to this is a hardware company and, there's a little software involved.
And why is that? Just because you can update the software, hardware, it becomes obsolete almost the moment it's hits the real world?
Yeah, well, 2 reasons. One, I believe it's the future of how we're going to conduct things. But 2, it's also better business. It's a higher margin business. It's a more recurring business, and it's a lot easier to do than manufacture hardware for the Defense Department, which is very challenging, and why a lot of the big defense primes dominate that, because it's a very hard thing to do, especially for a newer company. So software. Program of record, sort of visibility, clearly some revenue, and a product that I can see makes sense into the overall scheme of national security. And if I can see all of those things and understand, how this works as a public company, and that's, something that comes with, all the experience on the public side that I have. That to me is the most interesting story. And there's always going to be a case that could this product be used in the commercial world? And many do. I mean, Palantir, became and is a company now where 50% of their business at least is coming from commercial clients and the other half from government. And I think
I wonder if everybody thinks of them as a defense company just because of that, because people think of the other side of their business.
Yes, and I think that that's a part of sort of the bull case on a lot of these companies. And there's some that it's unclear how they're going to ever really be commercialized, but there are plenty of others that it's everything from drone delivery to cybersecurity to even space applications. There's when satellites are taking imagery, some of that's going to be for the government and some of that's going to be for commercial customers who want imagery of certain areas of the globe. And so that, what they call dual use, is something that is certainly a factor in thinking about kind of what you want to invest in, because it just opens up the market quite a bit more.
I asked about the defense companies, the large, mega defense companies coming in and either investing or hoovering these companies up, and how that was going to work. I should also flip it, right, and ask, what about tech companies who have large, we know AI is dominated by, the Magnificent Seven. Is it possible that they would also get in this area? Or again, do you think because of governmental concerns, that's probably not something that they would want to do?
No, I think that they will. I think that there's, just yesterday, there's a really good company, Center15 Systems, which helps companies navigate the approval process in the government. And Salesforce Ventures led that round. And so I think you're going to continue to see more and more companies investing in tech companies, investing in companies that do dual use type stuff, where they can, again, see value in how does this fit into their overall business. So yeah, I think that will continue. I think it will grow. A lot of these companies do a lot of business with the government, and whether it's AWS or Azure. And so there's plenty of reasons for those companies to help these earlier stage, private companies succeed.
Wow, that's so fascinating, and important, because for an average investor, do they have access to this new momentum in the defense sector, would you say, or is it mainly through the private market like that you're offering right now, or that you're spearheading with your fund?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a question of risk reward. There's less risk in buying Lockheed Martin than there is in buying an earlier stage private company, or finding a way through a fund or to participate in this theme. There's also, a difference in reward, right? I mean, the odds of Lockheed Martin doubling in price is it's going to take a significant amount of time. There are smaller private companies, public companies like Kratos and AeroVironment and different things, that are much smaller than the big primes that probably have significant upside still. But I think that it's really a question of people's appetite for, less liquid products, private equity really, versus sort of public markets. But, if you think that the nice thing about this sector is it's generally recession proof. And, if you believe in this thesis and the theme, the money's going to continue to come everywhere. And those defense companies, even the big primes, should, outperform relative to the S&P.
Do you invest in any companies outside of the U.S.? Is this same scenario that you just laid out about the changes coming, the growth opportunity, where the action is that happening everywhere around the world?
Yes. There's more and more of it happening in our allies. It's certainly not, impossible for me to invest in companies overseas. I tend to feel that the ones here are a lot easier for me to diligence. And most of my relationships in the Defense Department and the government are domestic. And so I feel like I can be the most value added there and have the highest chance of success for my investors.
Yeah. What's the attrition rate of companies dying in the Valley of Death? Because it sounds like they still have to navigate that, even if they are these newer companies. They still have to make their way through, a relationship with the Defense Department. You said it's getting smaller, that valley, but what's the sort of fallout there? Do some of these smaller companies, is that where they hit the rough spot and don't quite make it? How important is continuing to sort of make that process easier for the success of some of these and the chance for some of these innovations to actually get out and be used?
Yeah, I mean, it remains to be seen. I mean, the success rate's been very low for the last 25 years because there hasn't been that capital to sustain companies, even with good ideas. I think as more folks get into this, both on the company side, I think there's going to be some successes. There'll be plenty of failures. I think that companies really need to get really good venture backers as early as possible because those folks that have experience in this sector will tend to be the ones that can help these companies navigate the Defense Department because it still is very hard. It's very hard for small companies that have 50 employees and a lot of engineers that are leading these companies that don't have any Defense Department experience to understand how to play the game, how to get their product, get allocations, get different, whether it's non-dilutive funds or whatever the case may be. And these venture funds are the ones that, have been doing this for a long time. And if you get those venture funds on your cap table, they are in a position to really help develop your business. And that's, to me, is what I've seen has made the difference between companies that have succeeded in getting, into the Valley of Death and the ones that never even get there because they run out of cash. And even with the money coming in the sector, and there's quite a bit, there's a lot of companies being founded too. And so, they sort of offset each other. And then some of these businesses are incredibly capital intensive. Going into space, doing stuff like that, building autonomous aircraft, a lot of this stuff, it costs a lot of money. And so you really got to be smart about what the business is going to look like. And like I said, I think getting the right partners early is critical.
Yeah, venture's not just for the money, right? It's also for the expertise to help out the founders. Elon Musk playing in the space at all? Occurred to me. I should no pun intended that I should ask that.
He is the space. I mean,
He is the space.
SpaceX is the greatest example in the history of defense. How to show the government how this can be done by driving costs down dramatically, using private capital to build an alternative that has now become the de facto way for us to get into space. He's done it cheaper. He's done it faster than the government could have ever done. And so,
and some of the legacy prime players, as you say, we just saw that play out with the whole astronauts stranded in space and and the private spacewalk. Those two things playing out, Boeing versus Elon.
And that company is it's absolutely the best example, and what every dual use defense company aspires to be is how do we demonstrate the same kind of thing for the domain that we are focused on. And obviously his XAI Grok is going to play a role in this, and Starlink is again, it's been sort of a huge advantage to the Ukrainians when used appropriately. and further adds to the battlefield. And Elon, he's definitely been very supportive of our efforts and has continued to be sort of a demonstration of what can be done.
Yeah. So what any of your companies that you feel most positive about that you think will IPO first? How are you feeling about what's on your plate so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the IPO market, I think that there's an appetite for this sector, and there's an overall obvious Arctic freeze that's gone on for the last 2.5 years that I think is going to improve, second half of next year for a variety of reasons. But that's more of a macro discussion. But when I look at the sector, I think the companies that are in a position to tell that software story, that are clearly well into the programs of record, those are the companies that have a software story to tell. Those are the companies that are going to be able to go public, and they'll be able to go public in 18 months. I think that there are more structural questions around which companies are going to go public, which companies have the pressure to go public from their investors because they need liquidity. But I would say that in an overall sort of way, there is a very big appetite from a lot of investors who do not have exposure to this market and new market, cannot get the exposure for whatever reason. And when the companies go public, there will be significant demand. And so, the market will dictate that, but I do feel, and it's part of my thesis and why I started the firm, is that I do believe that we're going to see significant pickup in IPOs over the next 3 years in this subsector of the market.
And I'm assuming that is true no matter who wins the U.S. election.
Yeah, I mean, the election is clearly, it creates uncertainty, and it creates uncertainty in funding, and that always is a headache every year, it seems like, for the defense companies. But it's really hard to tell. It used to be pretty clear what party sort of favored big defense spending and which party didn't. And now, in many ways, that's either been turned on its head or it's totally unclear. So I don't know. What I'm pretty certain about is that internationally, these countries are going to continue to spend regardless. And that mix we talked about, the shift in spending, that is going to continue and continue in a big way. And as a result, I think that the companies that I'm looking at, that the firm is looking at, will continue to have significant tailwinds.
Ian, this has been an absolutely fascinating look at a really, really critical part of the global economy, and I think something we all need to be aware of as we read the headlines and have a lot of discussions about what is becoming a more multipolar world and kind of maybe the beginning of a new regime. So gave us a lot to think about. So much. Thank you so much for bringing your unique insight and expertise. It's really fantastic.
Well, thank you for having me, Maggie. I appreciate the time.
And come back and let us know how you're doing, and we'll tap you again as some of these companies start to go public so we can figure out what it's all about.
Happy to do that.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ian.
Thank you.